The desert sun blazed down on a stagecoach bound for nowhere but danger. Inside sat strangers with secrets, merchants, gamblers, a preacher, and one silent man who carried more than a gun. When the wheels groaned to a halt, the driver's face went pale. Apache riders emerged on the cliffs, their shadows stretching long, their silence louder than thunder. Trapped, outnumbered, and cut off from escape, every soul in that coach would soon face a truth they could not outrun. What happened next would not just test courage, it would tear open the line between survival and sacrifice. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The desert stretched endless and unforgiving, a sea of heat and silence where the sun blazed like molten fire in the sky, baking the land until the air itself shimmered with mirages. And through this desolate expanse thundered a lone stagecoach, its wheels creaking and straining, its horses lathered with sweat, nostrils flaring against the furnace wind that carried grit and dust into every crease of flesh. Inside, 4 passengers sat pressed into their own thoughts, each carrying burdens heavier than the rattling coach itself. One, a gray-bearded merchant, with eyes darting toward the leather satchel pressed against his chest, as if every jolt threatened to spill not only its contents of gold and contracts but also the illusion of safety wealth once promised, his fingers trembling though he tried to still them, his lips silently counting profits that could not protect him here. Across from him lounged a gambler, hat tilted low, lips curled into a smile too smooth, shuffling a worn deck of cards not for play but as a shield, as if the flickering images of kings and aces could distract from the cold calculation in his eyes that weighed not only odds but people, measuring who might fold first if fate turned cruel. Beside him sat a preacher, coat dusty, collar frayed, his Bible clutched so tightly the pages bent, whispered words of scripture spilling like cracked water over a stone. His faith tested by the unholy silence of the land, beads of sweat running down his temples not only from heat, but from the gnawing fear that perhaps God had forgotten these barren places. And in the corner, half hidden in shadow, rode a silent figure, face weathered, jaw hard, boots scuffed from miles of unforgiving ground, his revolver resting heavy at his hip, untouched but never far from reach. Eyes fixed, not on the passengers or the interior but out the narrow window, scanning the shifting horizon with a stillness that carried weight, as though he could see beyond dust and glare into truths others would rather ignore. And though he spoke not a word, his presence pressed against the others like a storm cloud waiting to break, a reminder that silence can scream louder than any confession. Outside, the coach rattled on, dust clouds trailing like ghostly banners in the scorching wind, the wheels biting into dry earth that seemed to swallow sound itself, leaving only the rhythmic pound of hooves echoing like a heartbeat against stone mesas in the distance. And still, no one dared speak of their destination, nor of what might wait along the trail. For the desert felt like a crucible, stripping away illusions and pride alike, and every jolt, every creak of wood, every gasp of horseflesh reminded them that survival was no certainty, that each carried sins or secrets or hopes too fragile to survive the open air. And so they sat in silence, 4 souls bound by chance, and one stranger whose quiet watchfulness promised that before long, the desert would ask more of them than they were ready to give. Inside the cramped wooden carriage, the desert sun pouring through narrow windows in streaks of gold and shadow, every glance seemed to speak louder than words dared. And in that silence the passengers revealed pieces of themselves they would never willingly confess. The merchant, stout and red, faced beneath his graying beard, clung to his heavy satchel as though it were a lifeline, his trembling fingers stroking the worn leather like a lover, eyes shifting nervously whenever the coach jolted, as though he feared that a sudden lurch might expose what lay hidden inside, for he had carried gold across these roads before, and contracts written in ink darker than honesty. And while wealth had once made him a proud man in town, here in the barren desert it made him a target, and he knew it. Beads of sweat rolling down his temple as he held it close to his chest. Across from him, a lean gambler reclined with a half-smile, his long fingers working a battered deck of cards over and over, the shuffle snapping softly against the wooden walls, a rhythm that spoke of patience, calculation, and a hunger that never rested, his sharp eyes glancing now and then at the merchant's satchel, at the preacher's Bible, at the silent figure's revolver, As if weighing each object as a hand to be played in some inevitable game, the gambler's dark vest embroidered with faded patterns of luck and fortune, his cravat stained but knotted with pride, his hat tipped low enough to cast shadows over eyes that gleamed like knives, cold and cunning, seeing more than he allowed others to know. Beside him sat the preacher, his thin frame wrapped in a dust-stained black coat, collar white but frayed, a small Bible cradled in his hands like fragile glass, his lips moving in whispered prayers that quivered with both devotion and doubt, the words nearly inaudible, yet pressing against the air like smoke, for he prayed not only for deliverance but for his own strength, knowing that the sins of those around him weighed heavy. And perhaps heavier still was the gnawing thought that his own faith, once unshakable, had begun to crack in the relentless silence of the desert, and every whispered word felt like both a plea to heaven and a desperate attempt to drown out fear. In the far corner, the silent figure sat as still as stone, shoulders broad beneath a worn coat, boots caked in the dust of 100 miles, his jaw unshaven, his eyes fixed outward through the tiny window as if searching the horizon for danger others could not see. And though he did not speak, the weight of his revolver at his hip seemed to fill the space with a quiet threat, reminding the others that violence was as close as breath, his presence less a man among them and more a shadow cast across their secrets. And in that stifling cabin, where dust swirled in narrow beams of light and the wheels groaned like an old prayer beneath their feet, no one dared break the fragile veil of silence, for each knew that words, once spoken, could not be taken back, and the desert was already listening too closely. The sudden jolt came like a gunshot, wheels grinding against stone as the stagecoach lurched forward and then shuddered to a halt, throwing dust into the air so thick it seemed to choke the very wind. And in that moment the rhythm of hooves that had carried them across endless miles of desert fell silent, replaced only by the sharp, panicked snorts of the horses as they reared and stamped against the reins, eyes wide and rolling as though they had glimpsed something no human yet could see. The driver, a gaunt man weathered by years of hard sun and harder roads, gripped the leather lines until his knuckles went white, his hat nearly slipping as he stared at the trail before them, where the land narrowed into a box canyon carved by time itself, walls of jagged stone rising steep and merciless on either side, their shadows falling like bars of a prison cell across the ground. And he knew at once there was no turning back, no veering left or right, only forward into a throat of rock that seemed to swallow light, a passage so tight it felt less like a road and more like the waiting mouth of a predator. Behind him, the passengers felt the change ripple through the air, the merchant clutching his satchel closer, as though gold could bribe stone, the gambler pausing mid-shuffle, cards slipping silently into his lap as his calculating eyes flicked toward the narrowing path, the preacher's lips moving faster now in prayer that tasted of fear, and the silent figure leaning forward slightly, gaze unblinking, jaw set, his hand resting near his revolver, as if the land itself demanded readiness. The canyon loomed, its high cliffs pocked with dark shadows that could hide anything, man, beast, or worse, and every heartbeat seemed louder than before, every creak of the wooden coach echoing against the stone walls until it sounded like the groan of something ancient, alive, and closing in. The driver licked his cracked lips, his face drained of color, whispering under his breath as though cursing his own eyes for leading him here, for he had driven this route many times and yet never had. The canyon seemed so suffocating, so final, like the tightening noose of fate itself, and even the desert wind had gone still, caught in that suspended silence before calamity, the horse's breath rising in frantic clouds, their hooves scraping against the dirt as if trying to claw backward from the path, refusing to be led into the jaws of something they understood instinctively. Dust settled slowly around the coach, clinging to skin, to clothes, to the fear thickening in the air, and though no enemy yet revealed themselves, the passengers felt it, the invisible hand of danger pressing down, the certainty that the canyon was not just stone but a trap, and once entered it would not easily release them, its walls towering high like judgment itself, a cruel reminder that in the west, even the land could conspire to kill. High upon the jagged cliffs, where the last light of the dying sun burned red across the stone, figures emerged one by one, silent as wraiths, their shapes rising against the sky until they seemed less like men and more like shadows called forth by the land itself. Apache riders astride lean, restless horses that pawed at the rock and snorted smoke into the cooling air, their presence so commanding that the canyon seemed to bow beneath them. Feathers tied into their long black hair stirred in the desert wind, the faint rattle of beadwork and bone ornaments carrying like whispers, and their faces, painted with stark streaks of red and black, caught the light in a way that made them gleam like masks of war, eyes sharp and unreadable, fixed upon the stagecoach trapped below. They did not speak, they did not cry out, and their silence cut sharper than any war cry, for it was a silence heavy with judgment, a silence that told the passengers below that the canyon now belonged to them, and that every soul within the wooden carriage was measured, weighed, and found wanting. Long shadows spilled down the sheer walls, stretching across the sand like claws of some vast unseen beast, reaching slowly, inexorably, toward the stagecoach, and those who sat inside felt the weight of that reach press into their chests, making breath harder to draw, making words falter in their throats. The merchant's trembling hand clutched his satchel so tight the leather groaned under the strain, sweat dripping from his brow as though each drop could be wrung out by fear alone. The gambler's sly smile had vanished, his deck of cards resting idle in his lap as his calculating mind tried to find odds in a game where the house was death itself. The preacher's whispered prayers grew louder, tumbling out in a desperate stream, his eyes wide and glassy, as if expecting heaven to part the sky, while the silent figure alone leaned forward, eyes locked on the riders above, his jaw hard, his gaze unwavering, as though recognition stirred in him, as though these were not strangers at all but ghosts of a past he had long tried to bury. The driver, still perched on the wooden bench, swallowed hard, his hands limp on the reins, his face pale beneath the shadow of his hat, for he knew that a single wrong move could ignite fire from above, and though the horses tossed their heads and stamped nervously, they seemed bound by the same invisible grip, unwilling to move forward, unwilling to retreat, frozen in that breathless moment where the world held its silence, waiting for the first spark. The sun sank lower, painting the canyon walls in blood and gold, the riders unmoving, statues carved by the land itself, and below them the stagecoach lay like prey in the open, surrounded not by sound or fury, but by something more terrible, an unspoken promise that the next breath could shatter everything. Inside the wooden shell of the stagecoach, panic rippled through the passengers like a fever spreading too fast to stop, the air thick with fear and dust as the looming silence from the cliffs pressed harder upon them. And the merchant was the first to break, his voice shrill and trembling as he demanded the driver whip the horses forward, to race through the canyon no matter the cost, his fingers clawing at the satchel in his lap, as if the weight of his gold could somehow buy escape from the inevitability hanging above. But his desperation only exposed the truth that wealth meant nothing in the face of shadows with painted faces and silent stares. The gambler laughed, not with humor but with sharp-edged bravado, scoffing at the odds of survival as though it were a game of dice he could still win, his words cutting through the rising fear like a blade, mocking the merchant's panic, deriding the preacher's muttered prayers. Yet beneath the smirk was a tightening in his jaw, a twitch of his fingers against the cards in his vest pocket that betrayed the gnawing terror clawing at him. For even gamblers knew when the game was rigged, and no trick of sleight or chance could tip the balance against warriors who already owned the canyon. The preacher, caught between faith and dread, raised his voice louder than before, begging them all to remain calm, to trust in providence, his hand trembling as he held his Bible higher like a shield, eyes flicking upward to the riders who stood still as statues, his voice cracking as though each plea was half meant for his fellow travelers and half thrown desperately at a heaven that had not yet answered. And his words, though fervent, seemed to fade before they left his lips, swallowed by the canyon's oppressive silence. Through it all the silent figure sat rigid, his body a coil of tension, jaw clenched, eyes never leaving the shadows along the cliff, every line of his face etched with calculation, not fear, measuring the distance between coach and canyon wall, between riders and rifles, scanning for something unseen, perhaps a weakness, perhaps a memory. And though he spoke no word, his stillness was louder than the merchant's demands, the gambler's mockery, or the preacher's prayers, for it carried with it a weight that told them he knew more than he let on, that he had faced danger like this before and that whatever was to come, it would demand more than gold, more than faith. More than wit, it would demand blood. Outside, the horses tossed their heads, pulling against the reins. The driver's lips moved in a muttered curse as sweat ran into his eyes. And the canyon seemed to tighten its grip with every heartbeat, shadows stretching longer, silence pressing heavier, until the passengers could feel it in their bones. The truth that fear had now hardened into something sharper, a brittle tension ready to snap. And when it did, no one knew who would be the first to break. The driver sat frozen on the high bench, sweat trickling down the deep lines of his sunburnt face. His wide-brimmed hat pulled low but unable to hide the terror in his eyes. And with a trembling breath he slowly raised his hands into the air, reins slack between his fingers, signaling surrender not to men but to fate itself, for he knew any twitch, any sudden movement could spark fire from above. The horses, sensing his release, stamped and whickered uneasily, their hooves scraping at the dirt, but even they seemed bound by the terrible stillness that had fallen over the canyon, a stillness so sharp it sliced through the air like a blade, cutting short every prayer, every whispered curse, every hollow laugh from within the coach, leaving only the sound of hearts pounding loud in their owners' chests. High above, the Apache riders remained motionless, their silhouettes etched black against the burning sky, their ponies shifting slightly beneath them, tails flicking in the wind, yet their bodies betrayed no haste, no fear, only the calm weight of patience, the kind of patience that belonged to hunters who already knew their prey had nowhere to run. And their silence was a message clearer than any war cry: you are seen, you are judged, and you are trapped. Inside the coach, the merchant's hands tightened desperately around his satchel until his knuckles turned white, as though gold might yet rise to shield him. The gambler leaned forward, cards long forgotten, his eyes darting between the passengers as if calculating whether treachery might offer better odds than surrender. The preacher pressed his Bible to his chest, lips moving without sound now, for words had become meaningless in a silence that felt closer to God's judgment than his mercy. And the silent figure sat unmoving but alive with tension, his gaze locked on the riders above, every muscle coiled like a spring, his hand hovering just close enough to the revolver at his hip to betray readiness, though he did not yet draw, for he understood this was not yet the moment for steel, that to act too soon would mean death for all. The canyon itself seemed to hold its breath, shadows stretching longer across the dirt floor, the orange light of dusk bleeding down the stone walls like spilled blood, and the silence grew heavier, pressing into their ears, into their bones, until even the gambler's smirk faltered, and the driver, arms raised high, began to tremble from the strain, his lips parting to speak though no words found their way out. Then, one of the warriors shifted, only slightly, a horse stamping against rock, the faint clink of beadwork breaking the spell, and that small sound rolled like thunder through the trapped company below, a reminder that the standoff was not an end but only the pause before fate's hammer fell, and whether it fell in mercy or in blood would depend on what came next, on choices not yet made but already circling like vultures above their heads. For the first time since the road began, the silent passenger spoke, his voice low and edged like iron, a sound that sliced the thick canyon air and made the trapped company lean toward him as if a bell had tolled, and he did not waste that single fragile moment with begging or bluster, but addressed the riders above in a tongue that belonged to the cliffs and wind, syllables measured and respectful, words that carried recognition and names forged by years spent between two worlds. Immediately, the figures on the rim ceased to be mere black shapes and became listeners, a leader inclining his head in a slow, careful motion that unspooled questions into the air and demanded answers of their own, and the canyon changed its weight. What had been threat first rippled into negotiation, then into something more complicated and old as the rock itself. Inside, the coach faces tightened and unpeeled in sequence. The merchant's grip on his satchel trembled as if at the edge of confession. The gambler's smirk fell away, leaving a raw curiosity. The preacher's whispered prayers hitched as if God had suddenly become a witness to history rather than an abstract comfort. And the driver, pale and slack-jawed, stared at the silent man as if for the first time he could read the maps of that man's life across his face. The speaker's eyes never left the rim where painted faces regarded him, and in those eyes there flickered a past, not of saloon brawls or ledger books, but of shared fires, traded tobacco, a name once given by a foster hand, a night sheltering under the same sky, a debt unpaid or a promise kept something intimate enough to startle the passengers with its truth, and dangerous enough to give the Apaches reason to listen rather than launch. He offered no grand apology, only facts. Names, a word of greeting, a mention of a camp that once sheltered him, a reminder of wrongs done by other white men that must be acknowledged. Small, precise phrases that read like keys offered to a locked door, and each key moved the riders in different ways, some relaxing the strain of muscle, others narrowing eyes with renewed caution. For recognition does not equal trust, and the canyon had no time for sentimental truths. Then he stepped from the cramped interior to the footboard and raised his open palms, not in surrender but in respect, voice steady, as he explained what manner of payment might satisfy both law and custom. An offering of goods, a promise to carry a message, the deliverance of a man who owed blood or forgiveness, and as he spoke his gestures were spare but honest, images forming between words like smoke rings, a shared winter, a healed wound, a child once saved, a stoic trade of honor for shelter. A hush fell again, different now, charged with the potential to save or to condemn, and every passenger felt the balancing of scales, the slim gulf between slaughter and a hard-bargained mercy, as the silent man's past uncoiled into the present, making him suddenly the slender bridge between survival and slaughter. And in that poised instant the canyon held its breath, waiting to see which weight the memory of kindness or the tally of old harms would tip first. Whispers rose inside the coach like snakes in dry grass, each voice slithering in secret directions. And though the silent figure stood outside, speaking carefully to the riders above with words balanced on the razor edge of respect and survival, those left within the wooden walls let fear fester into darker shapes. For the gambler's sharp eyes glittered with opportunity, his mind quick as dice tumbling across a table, and he leaned toward the merchant with a hushed promise, a scheme whispered through clenched teeth that perhaps, if gold were offered, or if someone else were sacrificed, a bargain could be struck that favored their survival at the expense of another. And the merchant, face pale and damp with sweat, clutched his satchel tighter, trembling between greed and terror, for he had long trusted coin to shield him. But here, under the gaze of silent warriors, he wondered if the weight in his lap was salvation or curse, and in that uncertainty he nearly convinced himself that shedding another's blood might be easier than spilling his own wealth. The preacher, caught between their low conspiracies, raised his voice in desperate prayer, calling on mercy, calling on divine judgment, his words breaking the fragile quiet inside and earning from the gambler a sneer, from the merchant a glare. Yet even as he prayed, his heart betrayed him, pounding with fear, whispering doubts into his ears about whether heaven listened to such pleas in a canyon where the ground smelled of dust and death. Outside, the silent figure's voice carried in steady tones, his gestures deliberate, weaving fragments of memory and shared history into a fragile tapestry of trust. But suspicion poisoned the air. Every Apache eye above narrowed with caution. Every breath from the passengers behind him carried mistrust. Every whisper seemed louder than it should, and the canyon itself seemed to echo with betrayal waiting to be born. The gambler licked his lips, calculating whether turning the others against the silent figure might tilt the odds in his favor. The merchant imagined throwing down his gold like an offering to appease the riders, but feared the blood that might follow. The preacher clasped his Bible so hard the leather creaked, whispering for strength while fearing that the test of faith would demand more than prayer. And all the while the man at the footboard, straddling two worlds, felt the knife edge grow sharper beneath his boots, for he knew that trust was not freely given, that every word spoken in Apache tongue was measured against centuries of lies, that one misstep would mark them all as enemies. And as he stood there, the canyon thick with silence and whispers gnawing behind him, he understood the cruel truth. The riders above might forgive, but those within the coach might not, and betrayal, whether by coin, by cowardice, or by fear, could strike from either side, making survival not only a matter of what bargain he struck, but of whether the frightened souls behind him could resist the poison curling through their veins long enough to let him finish it. The canyon seemed to tighten its grip as the Apache leader urged his horse forward to the rim, his painted face stern and unyielding, his gaze locked on the silent figure below. And with a voice that rolled like thunder through the stone walls, he demanded not surrender but proof, a gesture of respect, a recognition that survival could not be bartered with gold or cowardice, but must be earned through courage and memory. The silent figure stepped into the open, every movement deliberate, his boots crunching against the dirt as the passengers pressed to the windows of the coach, eyes wide, breaths held, watching as he raised his hands slowly and spoke in their tongue, naming old places, recalling a winter storm survived with their people, a time when fire and food were shared across boundaries meant to divide. And though his words stirred ripples of recognition among the riders above, they did not soften the demand for trial, for the canyon hungered not for speech but for action. One warrior descended the cliff path, eyes fierce, body painted with black streaks that marked him as one who had walked close with death. And he brought forth a ritual challenge, 2 knives laid in the dust. A test not of slaughter, but of endurance, of spirit, of whether the man before them remembered the ways he once claimed as his own. The passengers recoiled, the merchant clutching his satchel as though its weight might shield him, whispering that no bargain was worth blood. The gambler's lips parted in greedy fascination, eager to see what odds flesh could hold against steel. The preacher pressed trembling hands together, pleading under his breath that God deliver them without trial, yet unable to tear his eyes away, and all of them watched in horrified awe as the silent figure bent, picked up the blade, and faced the warrior with solemn resolve. They circled, the canyon echoing with the scrape of boots and the faint rattle of beads, neither striking quick nor careless, each movement slow, deliberate, testing, like 2 shadows wrestling for place in the firelight of dusk. And when steel flashed, it was not in reckless fury but in ritual, arms scored with shallow cuts that dripped blood into the thirsty earth. Blood not shed in slaughter but in offering, each mark a symbol of respect, of recognition, of survival through pain. The merchant groaned, covering his eyes. The gambler leaned forward with a grin both fearful and admiring. The preacher's prayers broke into sobs, and the driver sat rigid on the bench, pale as bone, while above the riders watched with grave stillness, their judgment resting on the outcome. The final cut was drawn, deep enough to stain the dust but not to fell, and the warrior stepped back, nodding once, his painted face unreadable, and the silent figure, bleeding but unbowed, let the knife fall and lifted his gaze upward, past and present colliding in his eyes. And in that moment the canyon itself seemed to sigh, for though blood had been spilled, it had been spilled with meaning, and the scales of life and death shifted by a fraction toward survival, though no one could yet say if the balance would hold. When at last the driver snapped the reins and the weary horses lurched forward, the stagecoach creaked back into motion, its wheels grinding over the canyon floor with a sound that felt more like an exhale of relief than progress. But though the passage opened and the riders above let them go, the air inside remained thick with what had been witnessed, and each passenger sat in the dim cabin altered in ways they could neither confess nor deny. The merchant slumped against the wall, satchel still clutched to his chest, but his eyes no longer gleamed with the false comfort of wealth, for he had seen how gold meant nothing when silence, respect, and blood decided fate, and he trembled with the knowledge that all his riches could not purchase peace of mind. The gambler, who once smirked at every twist of chance, now sat rigid, fingers twitching as though to reach for cards that could not steady him, and though he forced his lips into a thin smile, his hands betrayed him, trembling with the memory of knives flashing in ritual and blood spilled willingly into dust, for he realized that there were games beyond his cleverness, games in which the stakes were higher than he dared imagine, and luck itself bent beneath the weight of honor. The preacher, face pale and eyes hollow, held his Bible close, yet his prayers faltered on his lips, for though his faith was not broken, it had been shaken by silence heavier than words, and by a trial that no scripture had prepared him for. And he found himself staring out the narrow window, as if searching the heavens for a sign that God had not abandoned this barren land. And the silent figure, whose arm still bore fresh blood from the trial by fire, sat back in his corner, eyes dark and heavy with a burden only he could feel, for he had given not only flesh but fragments of a past he had kept hidden, and in doing so had bridged 2 worlds yet belonged to neither, his gaze distant, his jaw clenched, carrying the weight of sacrifice that the others could neither understand nor repay. The canyon walls slowly fell away behind them, shadows stretching long across the sand as if marking a grave they had narrowly escaped, and with every turn of the wheel the desert swallowed their trail, leaving behind only dust, as though erasing the fact that men had stood on those cliffs and demanded blood, erasing the truth that survival had not been granted freely but taken at cost. Silence held them as tightly as before. But it was no longer born of secrets. It was the silence of people who had faced the edge of death and returned, changed, stripped of illusions, left to wrestle with questions that clung heavier than any dust. What is courage when survival demands sacrifice? What is faith when mercy comes not from heaven but from men? What is wealth when it cannot buy safety? And what remains of a man who carries two worlds on his shoulders? The stagecoach rattled forward, its passengers bound once more to the endless desert. Yet now they carried more than satchels or Bibles or cards, they carried scars. Visible and unseen, the kind that the desert never let heal, the kind that whispered that survival was not victory, but simply the cost paid for another mile of dust and another hour of breath.